According to investigators, the backpack should have made the search easier. It was not a rare military bag. It was not a custom item. It was not something handmade or impossible to trace. It was a black 2.5-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack. And that detail mattered because the brand was tied to one retailer, Walmart. A store receipt, a payment record, a surveillance camera, a shipping address, a register number. Somewhere inside that system, investigators believed there may have been a name. But that is where the case became more difficult. Because if the records were as useful as they appeared to be, then the question became simple. Why had no one been publicly identified? Everything in this case is drawn from verified public reporting and named on-record statements connected to the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Nothing in this documentary should be interpreted as a finding against any individual. The investigation remains active and unresolved. Everything in this case begins with a routine that broke without warning. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived in the Catalina Foothills area near Tucson, Arizona, a quiet, private neighborhood where homes sit back from the road and silence is part of the appeal. It was the kind of place where people notice unfamiliar movement, but only if they are looking at the right moment. On the night investigators believe Nancy disappeared, one thing stood out immediately. The person seen near her home did not appear to be lost. He appeared prepared. The footage recovered from the doorbell camera showed a masked male described by the FBI as roughly 5'9" to 5'10" tall, with an average build. He wore dark clothing, gloves, and carried what appeared to be a weapon in a holster. He also carried the backpack. That backpack became one of the clearest physical details investigators could work with. And at first, it seemed like the kind of lead that could narrow everything down. Because a backpack is not just a backpack when it passes through a national retail system. It has a product code, it has a sales history, it may have a payment method attached to it. If it was bought online, it may have a shipping address. If it was bought inside a store, there may be register footage connected to the transaction. That was why investigators turned to Walmart. According to public reporting, Walmart provided records of Ozark Trail hiker pack purchases from several months, and investigators were reviewing surveillance footage from local Walmart stores. That sounds broad, but in an investigation like this, broad is not always a weakness. It gives investigators a list. A list can be reduced. Names can be checked. Addresses can be visited. Store footage can be reviewed. A person can be ruled out, or they can become more interesting. And before we go further, if you follow cases like this closely and you appreciate calm, fact-based investigations without exaggerated headlines, consider subscribing to SILENTVERDICT. These cases often change quietly over time, and sometimes the smallest overlooked detail becomes the most important one later. And if any detail in this case stands out to you personally, let us know in the comments. Many viewers notice contradictions others miss, but investigators were beginning to notice another problem. A purchase record does not prove who wore the backpack. It only proves where the backpack may have entered the world. Someone could have bought it for themselves, someone could have bought it for another person, someone could have bought it with cash, someone could have purchased it online and had it delivered somewhere else. And as Sheriff Chris Nanos later pointed out publicly, someone could have bought it from Walmart and then resold it somewhere else. That one possibility quietly weakened the entire lead. Not destroyed it, but complicated it. Because now investigators were not only looking for a buyer, they were looking for the path of an object. At first, the Walmart lead seemed clean. One backpack, one retailer, one database. But once resale entered the picture, the lead became less direct. If the backpack changed hands after the original purchase, the name in Walmart's system might not be the person seen at Nancy Guthrie's door. That is the kind of detail that makes an investigation slow down. Not because investigators have nothing, but because the evidence may be pointing to a person who is not the final person, and that distinction matters. A person whose name appears in a purchase record may be a witness. They may be a reseller. They may be someone who gave the bag away. They may be someone who no longer remembers the sale clearly, or they may be much closer to the case. Investigators cannot assume which one is true. That is why the silence around the Walmart lead became so important. If the records produced an obvious match, the public might have expected movement, a name, a search warrant, a visible update, but no suspect has been publicly identified. And that silence created a second mystery. Did investigators find too many names? Or did they find one name they cannot yet explain? Around the middle of the investigation, the public understanding of the case began to shift. Before the backpack, the strongest evidence appeared to be the recovered video. Then came the retail records. Then came the question of whether the suspect's movements suggested planning. The person at the door did not behave like someone reacting in panic. He appeared to understand where the camera was. He appeared to know how to approach the home. He appeared to carry equipment that suggested preparation. But that alone did not answer the deeper question. Why Nancy? A random burglary would usually leave behind a different pattern. Signs of rushed entry, obvious searching, property disturbance, a chaotic scene. But what investigators were examining appeared more focused, more controlled, and more difficult to explain. That does not prove motive, but it raises the possibility that Nancy was not chosen by accident. And once investigators begin considering that possibility, they have to look beyond the porch. They have to look at relationships, pressure, money, recent communication, unusual behavior, anyone who knew her routine, anyone who knew her home, anyone who knew she might be vulnerable. Not because those things prove guilt, but because kidnappings rarely begin at the door. They often begin earlier, with knowledge, with planning, with opportunity, with a reason someone believes the risk is worth taking. And that is where a name from Walmart, if investigators truly have one, would become more than a retail detail. It would become a test. Does the person fit the physical description? Were they near Tucson? Did their phone location match or conflict with their explanation? Did they communicate with anyone connected to Nancy? Did they make other purchases that looked ordinary by themselves, but concerning when placed together? A backpack purchase does not solve a case, but it can open a door. And sometimes the first name in a case is not the final answer. Sometimes it is the person who leads investigators to someone else. That may be why authorities have said so little. Because if the Walmart records produced a name, but that name only explains the purchase and not the disappearance, then investigators would be standing in a difficult place. They would have a lead strong enough to follow, but not strong enough to announce. And in a case this public, that silence can feel suspicious even when it is procedural. The disturbing part is not simply that the backpack was traceable. It is that it should have been traceable. The system was there. The records were there. The surveillance was there. The product was specific. The retailer was known. And yet the person seen at Nancy Guthrie's door remained unnamed publicly. That leaves investigators with a contradiction they cannot easily dismiss. Either the Walmart trail led to someone who has not been publicly revealed, or the cleanest lead in the case was never as clean as it first appeared. And if that is true, then the backpack did not just point investigators toward a name, it may have shown them how carefully someone tried to keep their real identity out of the story. The longer investigators examined the Walmart lead, the less straightforward it appeared to become. At first, the process sounded almost mechanical. Identify the backpack, pull the purchase records, review surveillance footage, match the buyer against the physical description, eliminate names one by one until the list becomes manageable. Former federal investigators speaking publicly about the case seemed confident that the process itself was reliable. According to those familiar with large-scale retail investigations, purchases connected to specific products can often be reconstructed with surprising precision. But confidence in a process is not the same thing as confidence in a conclusion. And somewhere between the Walmart records and the silence that followed, investigators appeared to encounter a complication they were not prepared to explain publicly. Because, according to investigators, the backpack was only one part of a much larger timeline. And this is where the case began shifting away from the object itself and back toward behavior. The person seen near Nancy Guthrie's home did not appear rushed. That detail continued to matter. The recovered footage showed movements that investigators later described as controlled and deliberate. The suspect approached the property late at night, moved toward the doorbell camera with apparent awareness of its location, and disconnected it within moments. That action alone raised questions. Not because disconnecting a camera is unusual in a planned crime, But because of what happened before, the camera went dark. The footage survived. According to public statements made by FBI Director Kash Patel, fragments of the video remained recoverable through residual back-end data connected to Google's infrastructure. Investigators later worked with Google engineers to retrieve portions of the footage through lawful search procedures. That process reportedly took days, which means investigators were not dealing with a simple saved video clip sitting inside an account. They were dealing with fragments, digital residue, partial recovery, a reconstruction. And that matters because reconstructed evidence is rarely perfect. It gives investigators pieces of a timeline, not always the entire thing. At first, the surviving footage seemed to strengthen the case. But according to people familiar with investigative procedure, partial evidence can sometimes create new uncertainty instead of removing it. Because once investigators isolate a suspect's movements, they immediately begin asking another question. What happened immediately before the camera activated? And what happened immediately after it disconnected? That gap became important, especially because another camera at the property reportedly detected motion later that same night, but no footage from that alert was preserved. Only the timestamp survived, a recorded event with no visual explanation attached to it. That detail may sound minor at first, but investigators were beginning to notice a pattern inside the timeline itself. Pieces existed, but not continuously. One movement was visible, another movement was implied. And between those moments, there were still unanswered gaps. That is one reason investigators reportedly began focusing heavily on digital reconstruction. Phone records, location history, communication timing, vehicle movement. Not because those systems provide certainty, but because modern investigations are often built through overlap. One timestamp supports another. One signal confirms proximity. One missing communication becomes meaningful when placed beside another missing communication. And according to publicly discussed investigative methods, that process becomes especially important when physical evidence remains incomplete. The difficulty is that digital evidence does not always say what people think it says. A phone location does not always prove who carried the phone. A deleted message does not automatically imply guilt. An inactive device may not actually be inactive at all. And investigators understand that better than anyone. That is why timeline reconstruction in cases like this often moves slowly, because every assumption has to survive scrutiny. Around this stage of the investigation, attention reportedly expanded beyond the backpack itself and toward the question of preparation. Not sophisticated preparation, not cinematic planning, careful preparation. There is a difference. The suspect appeared to arrive equipped, dark clothing, gloves, a backpack, a flashlight reportedly held in the mouth at one point during the approach. And according to forensic genealogist C.C. Moore, even that small detail may have mattered because objects repeatedly held against the mouth can sometimes retain biological material. Not always, not reliably, but potentially. That observation did not solve anything. Still, it quietly widened the investigation again. Now, investigators were not only examining retail records and surveillance recovery, they were also evaluating the possibility that the suspect may have unintentionally left behind trace evidence during moments that seemed insignificant at the time. And this is where investigative cases often become emotionally unsettling, because ordinary human behavior starts taking on new meaning. A person adjusting gloves, a pause near a doorway, a flashlight repositioned during movement, a backpack strap handled repeatedly. Small actions begin attracting enormous attention because investigators are trying to determine whether any physical trace survived the night. But according to publicly available information, no major forensic breakthrough has been announced. And that absence matters, because if investigators had immediately recovered a strong biological match, the Walmart lead might never have become so important in the first place. Instead, the backpack remained central. The object stayed in the foreground, and that suggested investigators still needed the timeline surrounding it. Who bought it? Who possessed it? Who transferred it? Who may have seen it before Nancy disappeared? But investigators were beginning to notice another issue. The suspect did not necessarily need to know Nancy personally to understand her routine. That possibility complicated the emotional direction of the case, because investigators could no longer focus only on close relationships or obvious personal disputes. They also had to consider observation, familiarity, patterns, people who may have watched the property over time. The Catalina Foothills neighborhood is quiet, but quiet neighborhoods also create predictable routines. Lights turn on at similar hours, driveways empty at certain times. Neighbors become accustomed to familiar vehicles and stop noticing them. That kind of environment can create comfort, but it can also create vulnerability, especially if someone spends enough time studying it quietly. And according to investigators, the suspect's movements suggested awareness of the property itself. That does not confirm prior surveillance, but it raises the possibility. And once investigators consider that possibility, they begin asking different questions entirely. Who knew the layout? Who understood the camera placement? Who knew Nancy lived alone? Who understood how isolated the property became late at night? And perhaps most importantly, who believed they could enter that environment without attracting immediate attention? At first, many viewers following the case focused almost entirely on the recovered footage. Then the focus shifted to Walmart. But now the investigation appeared to be circling something more difficult to measure. Knowledge, not evidence alone, not technology alone, but familiarity. And if the suspect truly understood the property as well as investigators increasingly appeared to believe, then the most troubling possibility was no longer simply that someone bought a backpack. It was that someone may have spent time learning Nancy Guthrie's life long before the camera ever recorded them. By the time investigators began examining the possibility of prior familiarity with the property, the case had already changed shape several times. First, it was a missing person investigation. Then it became a forensic recovery effort centered around surviving surveillance footage. Then the Walmart records shifted attention toward commercial tracking and digital transactions. But now investigators appeared to be confronting a more uncomfortable possibility, that the person who approached Nancy Guthrie's home may not have been improvising at all, because preparation does not always reveal itself through dramatic mistakes. Sometimes it reveals itself through absence, the absence of panic, the absence of wasted movement, the absence of obvious confusion inside a dark property late at night. And according to publicly discussed details surrounding the investigation, the suspect's movements continue to appear measured, not hurried, not chaotic, measured. That distinction became increasingly important as investigators worked backward through the timeline, because one of the central questions in the case was no longer simply who bought the backpack. It was whether the events surrounding Nancy's disappearance began earlier than anyone initially believed. Investigators reportedly reviewed not only surveillance footage connected to Walmart locations, but also surrounding traffic movement, nearby camera systems, and digital records capable of reconstructing movement patterns around the Catalina Foothills area. That process is slow for a reason. Modern investigations generate enormous amounts of information, but information alone does not create clarity. Sometimes it creates noise. A vehicle passing through an intersection may mean nothing. A phone signal near a tower may belong to dozens of people. A delayed text message may reflect poor reception rather than deception. Investigators have to determine which details belong to the case and which details simply exist near it. And according to people familiar with large-scale investigations, that distinction becomes especially difficult once public attention intensifies, because every known fact begins attracting interpretation. The backpack meant something. The recovered footage meant something. The disconnected camera meant something. But investigators still needed those details to connect coherently. And this is where the timeline reportedly became more difficult to reconcile, because according to publicly available reporting, Nancy Guthrie required daily medication and had limited mobility. Family members described her routines as structured and consistent. She was not someone known for abrupt, unexplained disappearances. That meant investigators were not working from the assumption that she left voluntarily. But the physical evidence also did not appear to support a simple forced entry scenario either. That contradiction sat quietly underneath the entire case. The suspect appeared prepared, yet the available evidence remained fragmented. and fragmented evidence often creates two competing possibilities. Either investigators are very close to understanding what happened, or the person responsible understood enough to minimize what would be left behind. At first, those possibilities may sound similar, but operationally, they are very different. One suggests progress, the other suggests concealment, and investigators were beginning to notice signs of both. Around this point in the investigation, attention reportedly shifted again toward communication patterns. Not only direct communication involving Nancy herself, but surrounding behavior before and after the disappearance. Missed calls, delayed responses, unexpected silence, changes in wording. Small interpersonal details that normally would not attract attention suddenly became part of a much larger reconstruction effort. Because in investigations involving vulnerable victims, behavioral shifts often matter as much as physical evidence. A person who normally responds quickly stops responding. A family routine changes unexpectedly. Someone sounds calm in a situation where investigators expect urgency. None of those things prove wrongdoing, but they can change where investigators look next. And according to investigators, the emotional dynamics surrounding the case were becoming increasingly difficult to separate from the physical timeline itself. That is often what happens in prolonged investigations. The evidence no longer exists independently from the people connected to it. Every statement begins getting compared against timestamps. Every timeline gets tested against digital records. Every recollection becomes vulnerable to contradiction. And contradictions do not always appear because someone is lying. Sometimes people remember events differently under stress. Sometimes people unintentionally compress timelines. Sometimes fear changes perception. Investigators understand that, which is why they rarely focus on a single inconsistency by itself. Instead, they look for patterns, repeated shifts, repeated gaps, repeated details that no longer align cleanly with available evidence. That process appeared to become especially important after investigators reportedly expanded the timeline beyond the immediate hours surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Because once investigators begin asking whether preparation occurred beforehand, they also begin asking whether behavior changed beforehand. Did anyone suddenly become more interested in Nancy's schedule? Did anyone begin discussing financial pressure differently? Did communication patterns subtly shift before the disappearance rather than after it? Those are difficult questions because they force investigators into emotionally sensitive territory. Family tension, financial dependency, relationship strain, unspoken conflict, not dramatic motives, human motives. And according to public discussion surrounding the case, financial pressure increasingly became impossible to ignore completely, not as proof, but as context. Investigators in cases involving elderly victims routinely examine access to finances, inheritance structures, caregiving dynamics, recent money movement, changes in account activity, unusual transfers, dependency relationships. Not because financial stress automatically creates criminal behavior, but because financial desperation can slowly reshape decision-making over time, especially when combined with emotional strain or personal instability. Still, investigators appeared careful not to publicly overstate any conclusion. And that restraint may be one of the most revealing parts of the case. Because despite the enormous public attention surrounding the Walmart lead, authorities have consistently avoided announcing a definitive narrative. That usually happens for one of two reasons. Either investigators are protecting an active strategy, or the evidence itself still refuses to settle into one clean explanation. And then another complication quietly entered the investigation: the possibility that the backpack may not have been purchased near Tucson at all. That detail changed the scale of the problem immediately, because once investigators consider out-of-state purchases, resale markets, or secondary transfers, the neat boundaries of the original Walmart lead begin expanding rapidly. A backpack sold through one retailer suddenly becomes thousands of potential transactions spread across multiple regions. And investigators are no longer tracing a suspect. They are tracing movement through a national retail system. That dramatically slows elimination. But according to investigators familiar with retail forensics, the process still remains useful because most transactions leave behind some form of recoverable footprint: a payment method, a store camera, An online account, a delivery address, something. The problem is that something does not always point directly to the person investigators are trying to find. And as the weeks passed without a public identification, the meaning of the Walmart lead itself began changing. At first, people believed the backpack might identify the suspect. Now, investigators appear to be considering something more complicated, that the backpack may instead identify a chain of people connected indirectly to the suspect: a buyer, a reseller, an acquaintance, a transfer point, someone who handled the object without understanding where it would eventually appear. And if that is true, then investigators may not be dealing with a single hidden movement inside the timeline. They may be dealing with multiple ordinary interactions that only became significant afterward, which creates a disturbing possibility that somewhere inside the Walmart records, investigators may already have the beginning of the answer, but not yet the person they were expecting to find at the end of it.